Star Wars gets remembered for the duels, the lightsabers, the trench run, the bit where somebody gets thrown down a reactor shaft. Fair enough. Those are the good bits. But the thing I keep coming back to on rewatch is the meetings. The saga is absolutely stuffed with rooms full of people making decisions badly. A council that dismisses, a senate that rubber stamps, a rebellion that calls its most accurate voice a lunatic and files him under extremist. And in nearly every one of those rooms, somebody says the correct thing, loses the argument, and then gets proved right by events they don't survive to see. So that's what I want to wander through tonight. 12 of them, one at a time. Not a ranking, they just sit alongside each other. 2 of them are murderers, one of them is a Sith Lord. Being right about one thing has never made anybody good. I'll be drifting across the films, the animated shows, the newer stuff, all of it, and I will be spoiling things freely. If you're new here, there's a subscribe button on this somewhere, and it helps me out. Right, let's get into it. So the argument about Barriss Offee has been running since about 2013, and it has not calmed down at all. If anything, it's got louder. You've got the people who think she was a terrorist who framed her best friend, and you've got the people who think she was the only Jedi in the entire Order with functioning eyesight. And the reason it never resolves is that both camps are looking at the same footage, and both camps are correct about the part they're looking at. I want to start here, because it's the most uncomfortable one on the list, and I'd rather get the uncomfortable one out of the way while we're both still awake. Some background first, since it'll have been a while for most people. Barriss Offee was a Mirialan, a Padawan under Luminara Unduli, one of the survivors of Geonosis. Green skin, black diamond tattoos across her face, a bit older than most Padawans. She preferred the archives to the battlefield, which in the Jedi Order during a galactic war was a bit like preferring the library to the pitch at a school that had just made rugby compulsory. She was Ahsoka's friend. They'd fought together on Geonosis in the second go-around, in the tunnels, the whole brainworm business, which is one of the more genuinely horrible episodes of that show, and not something I'm going to describe in detail at this hour. And somewhere across the years of that war, she came to a conclusion. The conclusion was that the Jedi had become soldiers, that they were the ones prosecuting a war they were supposed to be preventing, that an order of peacekeepers had turned into generals commanding an army of men who'd been grown in vats for the purpose, and that nobody inside the building seemed to find this strange anymore. She said all of this out loud, in a Republic courtroom, in front of the Chancellor, on what was effectively galactic television, that the Jedi were responsible for the war, that they'd lost their way so completely they'd become the villains of the thing, that they were the ones who should have been on trial, all of them. And here's the part that I think people underrate. Nobody in that room argued with the content. They arrested her, obviously, because she'd just confessed to bombing the temple. But nobody stood up and said, actually, no, here's why you're wrong about the Order. The response to the most serious critique the Jedi ever received from inside their own ranks was to remove the person making it from the room. Because she was right. That's the awkward bit. Within about a year of that speech, every single thing she said was demonstrated in the most comprehensive way imaginable. The Order was blind to a Sith Lord who had been sitting 3 floors away in the Chancellor's office for a decade. They were commanding a slave army that had been built by their enemy specifically to kill them. They'd been manoeuvred into a war designed from the ground up to destroy them, and they'd walked into it in formation, in uniform, with rank insignia. Her diagnosis was not just correct, it was correct in the specific way that matters, which is that it named the mechanism and not just the symptom. There's a smaller thing she was right about that, tends to get lost under the big speech, and it's the one that I think shows she'd actually been thinking rather than just seething. She'd noticed that the war had changed what the Order was for, not what it believed, what it did all day. A Jedi in peacetime was a negotiator, an investigator, occasionally a bodyguard. a Jedi in Year 3 of the Clone Wars, was a battlefield commander with a rank, a fleet allocation, and a casualty list. And the Order had made that transition in a matter of weeks without ever formally deciding to, because the transition arrived as a series of individually reasonable requests from a government they'd sworn to serve. Nobody voted to become generals. They were asked to take temporary command of an army in an emergency. And then the emergency went on for 3 years. That's the actual mechanism, and she named it, and it's the same mechanism that gets almost everybody. You don't get a meeting where somebody proposes becoming the thing you were founded to prevent. You get a run of sensible-looking, short-term decisions, and then one day you look up. Now, the method. She bombed the Jedi Temple. Clones died in that hangar, men doing maintenance work, and I don't think the show lets you forget that. She murdered Letta Termund in a holding cell to cover her tracks, using the Force through a transparent wall, which is one of the colder things anyone does in that entire series. And then she framed Ahsoka, her friend. She let Ahsoka be stripped of her rank, expelled, hunted across the industrial underlevels of Coruscant, and handed over to a military tribunal facing a death sentence. And she watched it happen for several episodes and said nothing. There's no softening any of that, and I'm not going to try. Being right about the institution didn't give her the right to do any of it, and the show is quite clear-eyed about that. But the structure of it is what I find genuinely fascinating, and it's a structure that's going to come up again a few times tonight, so I'll lay it out properly now, and then leave it alone. The story agreed with her completely on the facts, and then it made absolutely certain she was the last person in the galaxy anyone would accept those facts from. She wasn't refuted, she was disqualified. The message was true, and the messenger was radioactive. And once that's the situation, the message just doesn't go anywhere. It sits there being accurate, and nobody can pick it up. And there's a detail in that courtroom scene that I think is the single best piece of construction in the whole arc. Palpatine lets her finish. He's presiding. He could have had her removed the moment she started talking. He doesn't. He sits there, hands folded, and lets a Jedi Knight deliver a full-throated denunciation of the Jedi Order to a live broadcast audience of trillions. And only once she's completely done does he allow the guards to take her away. He's the only person in that room who benefits from every single word of it. Every sentence she says is doing his job for him. She thought she was exposing the Order. She was providing content. Here's where I land on it, and you're welcome to land somewhere else. I don't think the Order's failure was losing the argument to Barriss. Institutions lose arguments to their critics all the time and survive it. I think the failure was that she was the only one who said it. Thousands of Jedi, hundreds of knights and masters with decades of experience, access to an archive going back millennia, and the only person who looked at what they'd become and said the obvious thing out loud was a Padawan with a bomb. That's not a critic problem. That's a room problem. And there is a coda to all this that most people miss because it turned up in a fairly quiet corner of the canon rather than in a film. She survives. The Order falls, the purge happens, and Barriss Offee ends up in Imperial hands and eventually becomes an Inquisitor, which is about the darkest possible destination for someone whose original complaint was that the Jedi had become an instrument of state violence. She objected to being a soldier for a corrupt republic and ended up being a hunter for an empire, which is the sort of ending you would call heavy-handed if it happened to anyone else. But she doesn't stay. She walks away from that too, eventually, at considerable cost, and by the end of what we see of her, she's living quietly and refusing to do the job. I find that oddly satisfying, and not in a redemption sort of way. It's more that it confirms the shape of her. She was never really a person with a plan. She was a person with an extremely accurate sense of what was wrong and an extremely poor sense of what to do about it. And that combination will walk you into a great many rooms you shouldn't be in. Twice in her case. There's one last bit I want to mention because I think it's quietly devastating. After she was arrested, the effect inside the Order wasn't reflection. It was suspicion. Ki-Adi-Mundi later cited her as evidence that the Jedi had a traitor problem and used it to argue for harsher treatment of another fallen Jedi. So the practical result of the most accurate criticism the Order ever received was that the Order got slightly more paranoid and slightly more punitive, which is exactly the direction she'd been complaining about. And Luminara, her master, who was by all accounts a decent and serious person, was so shaken by it that she went off to Kashyyyk and threw herself into defensive preparations. Which is to say, she responded to being told the Jedi had become generals by going and being a general somewhere else. I don't know. There's something very human about that. You get told the building's on fire, and your instinct is to go and tidy a different room. There's an image from this arc that I've never really been able to shake. A clone trooper lying on a table on Kamino in the middle of the night, having brain surgery performed on him by a small medical droid. He has essentially talked into it. Not because a doctor authorized it, because nobody would authorize it, and he decided he was going to find out anyway. That's Fives. IRC Trooper, 501st, and the closest thing this list has to a pure case. So the setup. The Battle of Ringo Vinda, third year of the war, long grinding fight over a ring-shaped space station. A trooper called Tup, a friend of his, starts behaving strangely mid-battle. Goes glassy, walks up to Jedi General Tipler and shoots her in the head at close range. Then he comes out of it with no memory of having done it at all. Everyone assumes separatist weapon of some kind. Virus, chemical agent, something. Toop gets shipped back to Kamino for examination, and Fives goes with him, because Fives is the sort of person who goes with you. And on Kamino, the Kaminoan chief scientist, Nala Se, takes charge of the investigation. And what she does is very quietly make sure the investigation doesn't find anything. She recommends terminating Toop so they can study the brain properly. Shaak Ti objects. Tests get run that produce clean, useless results. And the whole time, Nala Se is reporting privately to Count Dooku, who has told her that the thing in the clones' heads is a safeguard against rogue Jedi and must not be discovered. Fives doesn't buy it. He teams up with a medical droid called Azai-3, gets the tumour out of Tup's brain, and finds it isn't a tumour. It's a chip. Then, because he's already in for a penny, he has Azai take his own chip out too. Then the two of them go down to the embryo chambers and find the chips being implanted into clone embryos at an early stage of development. All of them. Every clone ever grown. Going back to the beginning, he's now, at that point, one of maybe 4 people in the galaxy who knows the truth about Order 66, and 3 of the others are Sith. What happens next is the part I find genuinely upsetting. Nala Se injects him with something to make him erratic. He's brought to Coruscant, to the Grand Republic medical facility, to make his case. Palpatine turns up personally, asks Shaak Ti whether the information's been kept classified, which it has. Then he suggests, very reasonably, that the clone might speak more freely without an audience, and everyone agrees because of course they do. And alone in that room, the Chancellor drops the act and tells Fives the truth, confirms it, to a drugged clone trooper with no rank, no credibility, and no witnesses. And then stages the whole thing as an assassination attempt. And I want to underline how well constructed the trap is, because it's genuinely one of the nastiest things Palpatine does, and it's over in about a minute of screen time. He doesn't need to disprove anything. He doesn't need to hide the chip, or destroy the evidence, or discredit the science. All he has to do is arrange for the man carrying the information to look unstable at the moment he delivers it. The drug does that. The staged assassination attempt does that. And once it's done, the information is permanently unusable, because it's now attached to a story about a clone who lost his mind and attacked the Chancellor. Nobody has to be lied to directly. The Jedi aren't fed a false report. They're just given a version of events in which further inquiry would be an insult to the head of state. And they take it because taking it is easier and because they have 4 battles running that week. So Fives runs. and he's now a fugitive with the biggest secret in the galaxy in his head, and a face that a million other men also have. He gets a message to Rex, arranges a meeting, and Anakin and Rex both turn up. He's right there. He's got both of them in front of him, and he can't get it out. He's drugged, he's exhausted, he's been awake for days, he sounds exactly like a man having a breakdown, and the more urgently he talks, the less like the truth it sounds. Commander Fox and the Coruscant Guard arrive. Fives reaches for a weapon. Fox shoots him in the chest. He dies in Rex's arms. His last words are a callback to what Toop said as he was dying, something about the mission and the nightmares finally being over, which, if you've watched the arc, lands about as hard as anything in that show. And then the official report goes out. Both men were infected with a rare parasite from Ringo Vinda. Tragic. Nothing further to investigate. The Jedi accept it. The Senate accepts it. But here's the thing. Here's the bit that I think makes this one of the best pieces of writing in the entire saga. And it's a kind of vindication I don't think I've seen done quite this way anywhere else. Rex didn't accept it. Not really. He couldn't do anything about it. He had no proof. And his friend had died looking like a paranoid man having an episode. But he filed a formal grievance about how the case had been handled, on the record, into a Republic archive, where it sat, doing absolutely nothing for years. And then Order 66 happens, and Ahsoka, aboard a Star Destroyer full of men who have just been told to kill her, remembers Rex saying 2 words before the programming took him. Find Fives, and she goes to the archive. And she pulls Rex's grievance and Nalasee's logs, and she works out in the space of about 10 minutes what Fives had died trying to tell someone. That's how Rex's chip comes out. That's why Rex is alive for the next 30 years of story. A piece of paperwork nobody read, filed by a man nobody listened to, about a man nobody believed, doing its job half a decade after everyone involved had given up on it. There's a bit of his backstory that makes all of this worse, and I mean that as a compliment to whoever wrote him. He came out of a training squad on Camino, 5 cadets, and they were the ones who failed. Genuinely failed the final exercise in front of everyone, and got held back and marked as defective. The squad had a name, and the name was a joke about dominoes because they kept going down together. And what eventually made them pass wasn't skill. It was that one of them worked out the test was the wrong test and improvised something the instructors hadn't accounted for. So Fives, from the very beginning, is the trooper whose entire identity is built on noticing when the official procedure isn't going to work. That's the thing he was good at. It's the only thing he was ever good at, arguably, and the Republic had a use for it exactly once and then killed him for it. 3 of that squad died at the first posting. Another one lost most of his body and was presumed dead for years. By the time of the chips, Fives is the last one still walking around, which I think is why he takes Tup's death the way he does. He'd already watched everyone he started with go down in order. Fun detail I love, and it's a small one. Fives had already been in trouble before any of this. Umbara under General Krell, he was the one who wouldn't shut up when the orders stopped making sense. He had a track record of being the trooper who asked the awkward question, and it had already nearly got him executed once. So by the time he turns up on Coruscant with the biggest awkward question in history, he's already got a file. I'll keep this short because I don't much want to dwell on it. This is the hardest one on the list for me. Most of the people we're going to talk about tonight at least got to be wrong about something, or difficult, or unpleasant, which gives you somewhere to put the tragedy. Fives was right. He was decent about it. He did the work properly. He found the actual evidence, and he was killed by one of his own brothers on a landing platform. For it, there isn't a lesson in it. It's just what happened. Right, let's talk about something a bit gentler. There's a scene early in The Phantom Menace, and I mean very early, where a planet is being invaded. There's an army of droids marching through a swamp, and Qui-Gon Jinn stops to have a conversation with a Gungan. Not a strategic conversation. He's just being polite to somebody who's clearly having a worse day than he is. And Obi-Wan spends the next 2 hours of film gently vibrating with the frustration of a man who would like to get on with the mission. That, for me, is the whole character. The living force versus the unifying force. It's a distinction the films never explain properly, and the expanded material has been chewing on ever since, but the short version is this. Most Jedi of that era were trained to look at the flow of things, the long shape, where destiny was heading. Qui-Gon paid attention to what was in front of him. The being on the road. The moment happening now. And I've come round to thinking that the Jedi Order's institutional problem was exactly this. They'd become extraordinarily good at the long view and quite bad at the short one. They could tell you the Force was clouded and something dark was coming. They could not tell you that the man they had lunch with was the one doing it. He also had a habit that I think is underrated, which is that he kept picking things up. A Gungan nobody wanted, a slave boy on a backwater planet, a handmaiden he took seriously, a former Sith assassin he tried to rehabilitate, which went about as well as you would expect, but which he attempted anyway. The council read this as poor judgment, and to be fair to them, the hit rate wasn't brilliant, but the underlying method was sound, and it's the one every good judge of people uses. You don't assess someone on what they are, you assess them on how they behave when nothing much is at stake and nobody's watching. Qui-Gon was doing that constantly, in the middle of missions, usually to the visible irritation of whoever he was working with. So the things he was right about. He was right the Sith were back. He fought one on Tatooine, a Zabrak with double blades and no interest in conversation, and he came back and told the council in plain language what he'd seen. And the response from the two most senior members of the Jedi Order was essentially that they couldn't be certain. Yoda and Mace Windu between them, several centuries of experience, and the conclusion was that they would need to meditate on it further. Fun fact that always gets me, the Jedi had a rule about the Sith, always two, a master and an apprentice. They knew the rule. They'd known it for 1,000 years. So the moment Maul died on Naboo, the correct inference was available to anyone in the building, and Yoda actually says it out loud, that the question is whether the one they destroyed was the master or the apprentice. He gets to the right question, and then the Order just sort of files it and moves on with the decade. He was also right that the council had become too rigid, and he'd been telling them so for years. Fun detail here, he was reportedly offered a seat on the council more than once and never took it, because taking a seat would have meant abiding by their decisions, and he had no intention of doing that. Which is either principled or extremely annoying depending on which side of the table you're on. Probably both. I suspect the council found him exhausting in exactly the way that a certain kind of colleague is exhausting, where you can't fault a single thing they've said, but you'd quite like a meeting without them in it. There's a thing about him and the council that I think explains the whole relationship, and it's a matter of temperament rather than doctrine. The Jedi of that era had built a superb system for producing reliable people. Consistent training, consistent standards, a clear hierarchy, a master for every apprentice. And systems like that are wonderful at raising the floor. Nobody comes out of that pipeline useless. What they're less good at is the ceiling, because the same consistency that stops anyone being terrible also gently discourages anyone from being strange. Qui-Gon was strange, not in a dramatic way. He just kept declining to do the standard thing, and the Order had no category for that other than difficult. And here's the part that I think is a bit sad. They were fond of him. That comes through. Yoda in particular clearly had a lot of time for him, and the reason the council kept offering him a seat was that they wanted him inside the tent. It's not that they didn't value him, it's that they valued him in exactly the way institutions value their awkward people, which is warmly, at a slight distance, and without ever changing anything on the basis of what he says. And then the big one, the one that isn't a policy disagreement at all. He worked out how to persist after death, not as an abstraction, not as becoming one with the Force in the vague sense the Order taught, as a conscious, retained individual presence that could still speak. And the Jedi Order of that period had decided this was not possible. It wasn't a matter of debate for them, it simply wasn't a thing. He was right, and what makes it genuinely lovely is what the discovery ends up being for. It's not power, it doesn't do anything strategic, it doesn't win a battle. What it does is allow Yoda, sitting in exile on a swamp planet with nothing left, to be taught something by a student who died before any of it happened. And it allows Obi-Wan to be a voice in a young man's ear at the exact moment it matters. The most useful thing anyone in the prequel era discovered was how to keep giving advice after you'd stopped existing. Now the honest bit, he was probably wrong about Anakin, or at least the show never lets him find out. He was right that the boy was extraordinary, and right that the Order's rules about age and attachment were being applied like a filing policy rather than a judgment. Whether he'd have raised Anakin any better than Obi-Wan managed is completely unknowable, and I get slightly impatient with people who state it as fact in either direction. What I do think is that Anakin's specific catastrophe was a man who could not tolerate loss, and Qui-Gon was, of everyone available, the one least likely to teach him that loss was a policy violation. And there's a lovely bit of follow-through on it in the animated show that I want to mention, because it's easy to miss. Late in the Clone Wars, Yoda starts hearing a voice, just a voice, no body, in a moment of grief, and he tells the Council about it, and the Council's response is to send him for a medical examination. 900 years of experience, the most senior Jedi alive, and the institutional protocol, when he reports a Force phenomenon that isn't in the manual, is to check whether he's unwell. So he goes off and does it himself, without permission, on a series of planets the Order had largely forgotten about, and what he learns on that trip is the thing Qui-Gon had been trying to hand over for 13 years. Fun detail? By the end of that journey, Yoda has been shown a vision of the Republic's fall, and has essentially been told that the Jedi are going to lose. He comes back knowing it, and there's not a great deal he can do with the information, which is a very Star Wars kind of ending to a very Star Wars kind of quest. I like that the most important discovery of the era was made by a man who kept ignoring his own management, and finished by another man who had to sneak off to learn it. I'd go a bit further actually. Qui-Gon is the only Jedi in the prequels who behaves like a person rather than a civil servant, and I think the films know it, and I think that's why he's dead 40 minutes before the end of the first one. You can't have him in the room for the rest of it. He'd have ruined the plot by asking the obvious question. I want to start with the room itself. The Galactic Senate Chamber is one of the great bits of production design in the whole saga, and it's design with an argument built into it. A vast sphere, thousands of floating pods, each one carrying a delegation. The pods detach and drift into the middle when someone wants to speak. And the acoustics of the thing are arranged so that one man, standing at the centre on a raised platform, can be heard perfectly by every single person in it. It's a building that looks like a democracy and functions like a stage. And the whole prequel trilogy takes place in it. So, Padme. Her arc, if you look at it end to end, is quite grim in a structural way. She enters the saga getting a Supreme Chancellor removed from office through a vote of no confidence, which is her using the system correctly and winning. And she exits it, watching the man she helped install crown himself Emperor to sustained applause. 14 years, one career, from the system working to the system being used as the murder weapon. And across that career, she is right about a truly unreasonable number of things. She was right about militarization. The Military Creation Act debate is the one everyone forgets, because it's the boring bit before the arena fight. But her position was that raising a Republic army would make war inevitable rather than prevent it, and that a Republic which needed an army to hold itself together had already stopped being one. She lost. They raised the army. The army had been sitting on Camino for a decade, waiting for someone to lose that argument. Fun detail there that I think is the blackest joke in the prequels. She was arguing against the creation of a military. The military already existed. It had been ordered and grown and drilled and equipped years earlier by a conspiracy that needed the Senate to formally request it at exactly the right moment. She was arguing about whether to open a door that had been unlocked since before she took office. She was also right about Anakin, which is the one nobody wants to give her, because the way it's usually framed is that she was blind to what he was becoming. I don't think she was. Watch the last third of that film again. She's the one asking direct questions. She's the one who notices he's not sleeping and not explaining. She's the one who raises the possibility that the Republic they're defending has already become the thing they were defending it from, and she says it to him out loud in one of the few conversations in the trilogy where two people are actually talking to each other. And when she finally goes to him at the end, she doesn't go to be rescued. She goes to argue, and she loses that too. The thing she was wrong about wasn't what Anakin was. It was whether he could still be reached by words. Her whole career was built on the belief that a sufficiently good case, made sincerely to the right person, changes what happens. That belief is the reason she's on this list, and it's also the thing that kills her. She was right about the emergency powers. Everyone remembers the line about liberty dying to thunderous applause. And it's a good line, so I'll say it once and then leave it alone. What people forget is that she said the equivalent thing in about 6 less quotable ways across 3 films first, and nobody was listening then either. And then there's the Delegation of 2000, which I want to talk about properly because it's one of the odder bits of Star Wars history. Right, so this needs a caveat, and I'd rather give it to you up front than have you shouting at your phone. This material was filmed for Revenge of the Sith and then cut. It survives in the deleted scenes on the disc releases and in the novelization, and it's been referenced in later sourcebooks. So it exists in a sort of half-light where it's clearly meant to have happened, but you won't find it in the film. There's even a wrinkle where the novelization and some other sources disagree about whether Bail Organa actually signed the thing. So treat all of this as a thread, the films left on the cutting room floor rather than settled canon, and take it in that spirit. What it was, a petition signed by 2,000 senators, formally requesting that Palpatine hand back his emergency powers once the war ended. That's it. That's the whole radical proposal. Please give the powers back afterwards, as agreed. There's a scene called Seeds of Rebellion where a group of them meet in Padmé's apartment. Mon Mothma's there, played for the first time by the actress, who'd go on to play her in Rogue One and Andor, which is a nice bit of accidental continuity, and in that scene, Padmé argues that they should bring a Jedi in. She's got one she trusts. The others talk her out of it. Too risky, they say. We don't know how the Jedi fit into this. Let's work through the Senate first and see what we can achieve. They never get the chance. Palpatine moves before the petition does. And I keep turning that scene over because it's such an ordinary failure. Nobody in that room is a coward. Nobody's compromised. They're just doing the sensible institutional thing, which is to exhaust the proper channels before escalating. That instinct is correct in almost every situation a politician will ever face. It was wrong exactly once, and once was enough. Here's the detail I find genuinely bleak, and it's the one I'd keep if I could only keep one. According to the material around all this, once the pressure came on, roughly half the signatories quietly withdrew their names. 2,000 people signed a piece of paper saying, "Please return the powers you borrowed," and about 1,000 of them thought better of it, which is, I think, the most realistic thing in the entire prequel trilogy. Not the Sith, not the clones. A petition losing half its signatures, the moment signing it stopped being free. The other half became the rebellion. That's the bit worth holding on to. Mon Mothma Bail Organa, and the ones who didn't take their names off went away and spent 20 years building the thing that eventually won. So her position didn't die with her. It just took 2 decades and a lot of dead people to become operational. There's one more thing about her I want to say, and it's about how the story treats her rather than what she did. She gets silenced twice. Once by Palpatine, obviously, but before that by the edit. The scenes where she organises, builds a coalition, drafts a document, and takes a political risk are the scenes that got cut. And what remains in the finished film is a woman in a series of nice rooms, being worried about her husband. That's not a knock on the performance, it's just what's left when you remove the plot she was in. And that omission has done real damage to how she's remembered. There's a whole strand of fandom that thinks of Padme as a passive character who dies of sadness, and the reason that reading is available is that somebody in an editing suite decided the political subplot was slowing things down, which is, and I say this with affection, quite funny, because the complaint about the first 2 prequels was too much politics, and the fix applied to the third one was to remove the only politics that were actually going anywhere. Anyway, that's my hobby horse, and I'll get off it. I'm going to be slightly stubborn about this next bit. The prequels get mocked for the politics. The politics is the only part that entirely holds up. The romance is famously creaky, the dialogue does things to your ear, but the political spine of those films is a genuinely careful account of how a functioning republic votes itself out of existence over about a decade while everyone involved keeps thinking there's time. It's not subtle, it was never trying to be subtle, but it's right. And it was right about the specific mechanism, and Padme is the one holding the correct end of it for the entire run. She just never gets to say so. Her last scene is a birth and a death in a medical facility, while the man she'd have been arguing against is putting on a black cloak somewhere else in the building. Now, on the subject of accurate information arriving in the worst possible packaging, I want to talk about a man strapped to a wall in a droid factory on Geonosis. Obi-Wan's been captured. He's held in an energy field, arms out, feet off the floor. And Dooku comes in and has a chat with him. Very civil, slightly wounded in tone, as if he'd expected better manners from the Order. And in the middle of that chat he tells Obi-Wan the following, that the Republic is under the control of a Dark Lord of the Sith, that the man's name is Darth Sidious, that hundreds of senators are already under his influence, and that the Jedi should join him in stopping it. Every single factual claim in that speech is true. I want to sit with that for a second, because I don't think the films get enough credit for how audacious it is. The central mystery of the entire prequel trilogy, the thing the Jedi Order fails to solve for 13 years at the cost of its own extinction, is explained out loud, in plain language, by name, in the second film. It's just handed over, free, and it doesn't matter at all. Obi-Wan's response is that it can't be true, the Jedi would have sensed it, which is, when you look at it, the exact belief that made the whole thing possible in the first place. And when he reports back, the Council does slightly better than nothing. Mace considers it. Yoda gets closer to the truth than anyone else does, muttering about the dark side clouding everything. But the operating conclusion is that Dooku was lying to sow discord, because that is what a Sith Lord does. And Dooku had by that point revealed himself to be a Sith Lord. So obviously he was lying. The reasoning is airtight, and it's completely wrong. This is the same shape as Barriss, and I said I'd not chew that over twice, so I'll just note it and move on. Disqualified messenger, unusable truth. But there's something specific about Dooku that I think is worth pulling out, which is that he was also right about the thing he'd left over, because he did leave, before any of it. Dooku had been a Jedi Master, one of the most respected in the Order, trained by Yoda personally, and at some point in the years before the war, he handed the whole thing back and walked out. And the stated reason was that the Order had become an arm of a corrupt Senate, that it was serving politics rather than the Force, that it had stopped being what it claimed to be. He was right about that too. He resigned on a principle that was completely sound, and then went and did something considerably worse with it, which is a specific kind of person that I think most of us have met at least once. Hopefully not in a context involving lightning. Fun detail I love here, and it's one of the neatest bits of construction in the prequels. Dooku trained Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon trained Obi-Wan. So the two Jedi we've talked about tonight, who were most persistently right about the Order's blind spots, and most persistently ignored, come out of the same lineage. That doesn't feel accidental to me. The Order kept producing people who could see the problem and kept having no idea what to do with them, and it lost one of them to death and the other to the enemy, and in both cases it wrote off the information along with the person. Now, the honest accounting, because I don't want anyone thinking I'm doing a rehabilitation here, he was lying about basically everything else. The offer to Obi-Wan was not sincere. He wasn't fighting Sidious, he was Sidious's apprentice, and he'd been one for years by the time he made that speech. He was building the very thing he was warning about. He'd had his old friend Sifo-Dyas killed and taken over the clone project. He was the one issuing the orders to Nala Se to keep the chips hidden, which means the same man who told Obi-Wan the truth about the Sith spent that same period making sure nobody found out how the Jedi were going to die. It's worth sitting with what that makes him, actually. Dooku spends his entire second act delivering true statements for false reasons. The Republic is corrupt, and he says so while corrupting it. The Jedi have lost their way, and he says so while arranging their extermination. The Senate is controlled by a Sith, and he says so while being that Sith's employee. Every word out of him is accurate, and every word is in service of the thing he's describing. I don't think fiction attempts that very often, because it's confusing, and it doesn't give the audience anywhere comfortable to stand. And the ending is about as unceremonious as it gets. 2 hands off, disarmed, on his knees in front of a young man he'd been told was going to be his replacement. And Palpatine tells that young man to kill him. And he does, and the whole thing takes about 8 seconds. He'd been Sidious's most valuable asset for over a decade. He was retired the moment a better one became available. One more thing on Dooku, because there's a piece of the puzzle he was personally responsible for that makes the whole thing tighter. The clone army didn't come from nowhere, it was ordered by a Jedi. Sifo-Dyas, a member of the council, acting entirely alone and without approval because he'd had a vision of a coming war and decided somebody had to do something about it. He went to Kamino, he placed the order, and he even specified the safeguard chips on the reasoning that an army that could be turned against its commanders was safer than an army that couldn't. And then Dooku, his old friend, had him killed, took over the project and quietly repurposed the safeguard into the mechanism that would eventually kill every Jedi in the galaxy. So the Order's own paranoia about itself is the thing that ends it. A Jedi Master worried about rogue Jedi built the switch. A different Jedi Master, gone over, rewired what the switch did. And the Council spent the entire war commanding an army whose existence they had never explained to themselves properly, and whose origin they investigated approximately once. And there's a second order effect that I think is the really damning bit. Because once the army exists and the war is running, nobody has time to ask where it came from. The question of the clone's origin becomes an administrative curiosity, rather than the most urgent security matter in the galaxy, purely because everyone involved is busy using them. You do not audit the supply chain in the middle of the delivery. Fun detail, when they finally do look into where the army came from, the Kaminoans tell them Sifo-Dyas ordered it, and the Council's reaction is essentially bafflement, followed by moving on to the next agenda item. They had the thread. They pulled it about 2 inches. This is my favourite structural joke in Star Wars, by the way, and I don't think enough people talk about it. The answer to the entire prequel mystery is given away in the second film by a man nobody can afford to believe, and then everyone in the room forgets about it. and then 11 years of story happen anyway. That's very funny. It's tragic, obviously, but it's also very funny, and I don't think those two things are in conflict. Let's start at the end of it. A young woman walking down the steps of the Jedi Temple in the late afternoon light, not turning around. Her master's at the top of the stairs asking her to reconsider. She keeps walking. It's about 90 seconds of animation, and it's one of the best endings to a season of anything I've seen. So, how she got there? Somebody bombed the Jedi Temple hangar. Ahsoka was assigned to investigate, ended up alone in a cell with the prime suspect, and the suspect died in front of her. Throttled by a Force user Ahsoka couldn't see, which meant Ahsoka was, on the available evidence, the only person in the room who could have done it. She ran, which didn't help, and there followed a genuinely well-directed stretch of episodes where she's fleeing through the industrial guts of Coruscant, being hunted by the army she'd been commanding a week earlier. Then the council convened, and this is the bit I want to spend time on, because it's not really about Ahsoka at all. Tarkin, on behalf of the Senate, wanted her expelled from the Order so she could be tried in a military court. Obi-Wan argued that the council should refuse and stand by her. Ki-Adi-Mundi and Saisi Tian said the circumstantial evidence was too strong. And Mace Windu made the observation that decided it, which was that protecting her could be read as the Jedi opposing the Senate. That's the reason. Not the evidence, the optics. And it's worth saying who was actually in that room, because this wasn't a rogue faction. This was the whole council. Yoda was there, Obi-Wan was there, and argued against it and got outvoted. Plo Koon, who had personally found Ahsoka as a small child and brought her to the temple, was there, which means the decision wasn't made by people who didn't know her. It was made by the people who had raised her in a building she'd lived in since she was 3, and they arrived at it in what appears to be under an hour. That's the bit that I think is genuinely instructive. There's a comfortable assumption that this sort of thing happens because of distance, because the people at the top don't know the people at the bottom. And here the opposite is true. They knew her perfectly well. Knowing her was not the operative factor, because the operative factor was a political calculation, and political calculations are extremely good at absorbing people you know. So they voted her out, stripped her rank, cut off her Padawan braid in front of everyone, which is a genuinely brutal little piece of ceremony, and handed a teenage girl over to Tarkin to face a military tribunal that was going to execute her. She was innocent, obviously. Anakin found Barriss, dragged her into the court, and the whole thing collapsed. And afterwards, the council brought Ahsoka back in and offered to reinstate her. And the framing they used was that this had been her great trial, that she'd come through something difficult, and it had made her a truer Jedi, which is, when you think about it for 2 seconds, an absolutely extraordinary thing to say to someone you just fed to Tarkin to protect your standing with the legislature. They'd handed her over and then congratulated her on the growth opportunity. She said no, took the braid, or rather didn't, walked out, and the last thing Anakin says is basically that he understands, because he'd thought about leaving himself. There's a small moment in the trial sequence that I keep noticing. When they cut the braid off, they do it as a formal ceremony, with the whole council present standing. It's not a punishment in the practical sense. It's a rite. Somebody in that order at some point sat down and designed a procedure for expelling a child and made it dignified, and it had presumably been used before. That tells you something about the institution that nothing in the films does. They had a form for this. Now, was she right? I think she was right in the most literal, unarguable, load-bearing way available, and here's why. The order that expelled her to manage its political position was destroyed within a year by the politics it was managing. That's not a metaphor. That's the sequence of events. They made a calculation that the Senate's opinion mattered more than one of their own, and the Senate they were placating was an instrument of the man who had already decided to kill all of them. Her read on that institution was that it had stopped being trustworthy, and she was correct with about 11 months to spare. And there's a practical consequence too, which is that she survived. Everyone in that chamber died. The ones who voted her out, the ones who voted against, all of them, within the year. The Padawan they'd cast out was the one standing on a Star Destroyer with a plan when the Order came down. That's where she picks up Five's work, incidentally. I'm not going through that again, we did it properly earlier, but it's worth noticing that the reason she was in a position to use it is that she'd spent a year outside the building, and the reason she was outside the building was that they'd thrown her out. There's an arc after she leaves that I think is the most underrated stretch in the whole show, and it's the one that proves the point. She ends up in the lower levels of Coruscant, no rank, no money, sharing a flat with two sisters who run small-time cargo jobs. And they don't know who she is, and she doesn't tell them. And she has to listen to them talk about the Jedi. And what they say is that the Jedi are useless, that they'd never once turned up when it mattered, that their parents had died in an incident the Jedi were involved in, and nobody from the temple had so much as sent word afterwards. It's not a political critique, it's just the view from the bottom of a very tall city, delivered by people who've never had a reason to think about it twice. And Ahsoka can't argue with any of it. She tries a bit, and it doesn't go anywhere, because they're describing their actual lives. That's the thing that finished it for her, I reckon. Not the trial. The trial was a betrayal, and betrayals you can be angry about. This was worse than a betrayal. This was finding out that from a certain very ordinary angle, the whole institution had simply never been there at all. Fun detail that I find quite moving. She never takes the title back. Not once, not properly. Rebels, Mandalorian era, the lot. She's asked directly at various points, and she gives some version of I am no Jedi. She'll do the work, she'll teach it to other people, she'll carry the lightsabers, she just won't take the membership card. And I've always read that as less about bitterness and more about her having actually thought it through, and concluded that the label was part of the problem. Personal opinion, and I've changed my mind about this a few times over the years. I used to read the walk down the steps as the story punishing the council, making them look foolish. Now I read it as the council punishing itself, and not knowing it's happening. Nobody in that room thought they were doing anything unusual. They thought they were making a difficult institutional decision under time pressure with incomplete information, which is exactly what they were doing, and it was still the worst call any of them ever made. And that is nearly always how it goes. It rarely looks like a confrontation at the time. It usually looks like a slightly awkward meeting that everyone has forgotten about by the weekend. Right, and having just used the man as an example of the council at its worst, I should probably be fair to him, because Mace Windu has one of the strangest reputations in the fandom, and I don't think it's deserved. The received wisdom goes something like this. Arrogant, cold, distrusted Anakin for no good reason. Went to arrest Palpatine and got himself killed by being self-righteous about it. And there's a whole cottage industry of takes where the fall of the Republic is basically pinned on Mace being unpleasant at the wrong moment. The problem with all of that is that he was right about nearly everything, and the record on this is not really ambiguous. Start with Anakin. Mace didn't want him trained. That's the first thing, and it's in the first film. Then he didn't want him on the council. Then when Palpatine forced him onto the council anyway, Mace refused to grant him the rank of Master, which everyone treats as a petty snub, and which was, in institutional terms, entirely correct. Because a Jedi appointed to the council by the Chancellor as a personal representative is not a Jedi appointment, it's a political placement, and granting him the rank would have ratified it. Then he didn't want Anakin coming along to arrest Palpatine. He told him to wait in the council chamber, and Anakin came anyway and cut Mace's hand off, and that was that. Every one of those calls was correct. The security concern he had about Anakin was a real security concern about a real security risk, and the specific thing he was worried about is the specific thing that happened. And then there's the arrest itself, which is where the argument really lives. He goes in with 3 other masters. Palpatine kills all 3 of them in about 4 seconds, which should tell you something about the situation Mace was in. And then Mace beats him, actually beats him, disarms him, has him on the floor by a window with a lightsaber at his throat, and the whole thing effectively over. And he hesitates, not for long, for about the length of 1 sentence. Anakin's shouting that it isn't the Jedi way, that he should stand trial, and Mace says the thing about him being too dangerous to be kept alive. And in the gap between those 2 lines, Anakin makes his choice. I've seen it argued endlessly that Mace was wrong to be about to kill him. I think that's mad, honestly. He was standing over a man who had just murdered 3 Jedi Masters in 4 seconds, and who controlled the entire judicial apparatus that would supposedly try him. There was no trial available. There was never going to be a trial. The idea that you could arrest Palpatine and have him processed by the Republic legal system is the sort of thing that only sounds reasonable if you haven't thought about who runs the Republic legal system. So here's the sad shape of it. He was right about Palpatine, he was right about Anakin, and being right about the second one is exactly what stopped him doing anything about the first one, because the person he'd correctly identified as unreliable was standing behind him at the critical moment. Where he was wrong, and I do think he was wrong about this, is everything to do with delivery. Because he was correct about Anakin for over a decade, and completely unable to make being correct to Anakin survivable. The distrust was warranted. The way it was expressed was cold, procedural, and never once accompanied by any explanation. A young man who had been told his whole life that he was the chosen one, and who was hearing from the Order's second most senior figure a constant low hum of "you are a problem," with no route offered for becoming not a problem. And Palpatine, meanwhile, was being warm at him for 13 years. That's the failure, not the assessment. The assessment was right. The failure is that being right in a tone nobody can hear is functionally the same as being wrong, and it costs the same amount. Fun detail worth an aside. The emergency powers get granted with the Jedi standing right there. The Council watched a legislature hand one man unlimited authority, and their response was to accept the military commissions that came with it. They saw the mechanism perfectly well and took the job anyway. So the Order's record on this isn't that it failed to notice, it's that it noticed and decided it could manage the situation from the inside, which is a much more embarrassing failure and one that shows up in institutions constantly. There's one more Council decision I want to flag, and it's the one that I think is genuinely damning, and it involves Mace directly. Somewhere in the middle of the war, the Jedi worked out that their connection to the Force had weakened. Their ability to sense things, to see ahead, to do the one job that made them uniquely useful to the Republic, had measurably degraded, and they knew it, and they decided not to tell anyone. Not the Senate, not the Chancellor, not the public. The reasoning was that if it got out that the Jedi were diminished, it would damage morale and invite exactly the sort of political attack they were already under. Which, look, I understand the logic. It's the logic every organisation reaches for when it discovers something embarrassing about its own capability. But think about what it actually means. The Republic's entire justification for putting Jedi in command of armies was that Jedi could perceive things ordinary officers couldn't. The Jedi found out that was no longer reliably true and kept commanding the armies anyway. So the Order that was about to be destroyed by a conspiracy it couldn't see had already privately established that it could no longer see very well, and elected to keep that between themselves. That's not arrogance exactly. It's something more ordinary and more human, which is an institution deciding that a difficult disclosure can wait until after the current crisis. There's never not a current crisis. Personal opinion. I think Mace's real failure was 10 years long and had nothing to do with the hesitation. He was the man in the building who'd read the situation most accurately, and he never once found a way to say it that made anyone want to agree with him. And the person he most needed to convince was the person he was worst at talking to. There's a small thing at the very end of his run that I find quietly awful. When he goes to make the arrest, he doesn't tell the rest of the council. He takes 3 masters and goes, on his own authority, at speed because he'd concluded there wasn't time, and possibly because he wasn't certain the full council would back him. Which means the most senior decision-making body in the Jedi Order found out that its second-in-command had gone to arrest the head of state after he'd already left the building. He'd spent 13 years being right and losing votes, and at the one moment it mattered he stopped holding the vote. I don't think you can really blame him for that. I do think it's the single clearest picture of what happens to a person who's been correct in a room that doesn't listen for long enough. Being right and being persuasive turn out to be almost entirely separate skills. Most of the people on this list have got the first one, and none of them have got the second. There's a scene on Mandalore near the very end of the Clone Wars that I think about more than almost anything else in that show. Maul is in a cell. Ahsoka's brought him in, and he asks for Obi-Wan Kenobi, and when he doesn't get him, he tells Ahsoka instead. He says the war has been a construction from the beginning, that the Sith Lord running it is nearly finished, that Anakin Skywalker is the mechanism, that he's already been groomed for it, and that the whole thing turns on him. And he offers to help, genuinely offers. Kill Skywalker together, now, before it happens. And Ahsoka refuses, obviously, because a former Sith Lord in a cell has just asked her to murder her best friend on the strength of his word alone. There is no version of that conversation where she says yes. The refusal is correct. He was still right, every part of it. The timing, the mechanism, the man. He'd worked out the shape of Palpatine's endgame from the outside, with no access, purely from having once been on the inside of it. That's the thing about Maul that I think gets buried under all the horns and the double lightsaber. He understood Sidious better than anybody alive, and he understood him for a very specific reason, which is that he'd been discarded by him. He was raised as a weapon, spent his youth being made into the sharpest possible instrument, and then he got cut in half on Naboo, and the response from his master was to move on and hire a count. No search, no retrieval, nothing. He spent years on a scrap planet, half insane, on spider legs, eating whatever he could catch. And when he came back with the one thing no Jedi had, which was an accurate model of how Palpatine actually operates. Not as a philosophy, as a personnel policy. You are useful, and then you are not, and there is no third stage. So he keeps being right, and he keeps being unusable, because the man delivering the accurate strategic assessment had, by that point, killed Satine in front of Obi-Wan specifically to hurt him. Not for a strategic reason. He worked out that Kenobi loved her and did it as a message. That's who's making the offer. And I think there's something almost funny about how thoroughly he disqualified himself from ever being believed about anything, purely as a hobby. We've done this pattern twice already tonight, so I won't labour it. True information, unusable source. Now the bit I actually find moving, which is what happens to him afterwards. He survives the war, he survives the Empire's arrival, and in Rebels, decades later, he turns up on Malachor, and he's still working on the same problem. He's still right about the important thing, which is that Kenobi is alive, and that Kenobi matters. Everyone else has written Obi-Wan off as a dead Jedi from a war that ended. Maul, alone in the galaxy, has correctly identified that the man is out there, and that his location is the single most strategically significant fact in existence. He spends years on it, and he's right. Obi-Wan is out there, and the thing he's guarding is the thing that eventually undoes the Empire. The ending is about a minute long, and it's beautiful. He finds him on Tatooine, old man, old robes, a fire in the desert. They circle each other. Maul makes his raid out loud, that Kenobi wouldn't be hiding in a wasteland for no reason, that he must be protecting something. Then 3 moves, and it's over, because Obi-Wan has had 20 years, and nothing to do but get better. And Maul, dying in the sand, asks about the boy, whether he's the chosen one. and Obi-Wan tells him he is, and Maul says something about him avenging them, which lands as one of the more generous things anyone says in the whole saga, given who's saying it. Then Obi-Wan holds him while he dies, which is not something he owed him at all, and when he finally does get to Kenobi, he doesn't attack him. That's the thing people forget about that scene. He turns up and he circles and he talks, because after all those years, the thing he actually wants is confirmation. The fight is almost an afterthought, and it takes about 3 seconds. Fun detail? He gets his last question answered. That's rare on this list. Almost nobody we've talked about tonight gets told that they were right about anything. And Maul, of all people, gets an old enemy holding him in the sand, confirming his final theory. He'd been correct about Kenobi, correct about the boy, correct about the whole shape of it, and the confirmation cost him nothing but everything. And I want to give him credit for one more thing, because it's the read that nobody else in the galaxy had. In the middle of the war, he goes and takes Mandalore. Not through an invasion, he does it politically. He assembles a coalition of criminal syndicates, installs a puppet, engineers a crisis, and lets the population invite the strong man in to fix the crisis he created. And it works. He runs the planet. Now that is not a Sith apprentice being violent. That is a man reproducing, from memory, the exact method his old master had been using on the Republic for 2 decades. Manufacture the problem, offer yourself as the solution, be granted the authority rather than seizing it. There's a smaller thing in that same period that I like even more. He goes looking for allies, and the ones he picks are the criminal syndicates, not the separatists, and not any disaffected corner of the Republic. And the reason is that he'd worked out that the war was a stage production, and that both governments in it were being run by the same man. So going to either side for help was pointless. The only organisations in the galaxy that weren't part of the arrangement were the ones operating outside it entirely. That is an extraordinarily good piece of analysis arrived at from a scrapyard by someone the entire galaxy had written off as a dead assassin from a decade earlier. He'd been paying attention. That's the whole point. He was the only person in the story who had watched Palpatine's technique from close range and understood it as a technique rather than as bad luck. And the reason I find that so interesting is that it means his warnings weren't guesses. He wasn't intuiting the endgame. He'd run a small-scale version himself and knew what stage it was at. He was the single best qualified analyst of Palpatine's plan alive, and the only people he could get in a room with were people who had extremely good reasons to want him dead. Maul works far better as a fixation than as a villain, and the animated shows worked this out about 15 years before anyone else did. As a villain, he's a stunt performer with a nice weapon. As a man who has organised his entire post-mortem existence around 2 accurate observations that nobody will act on, he's one of the most interesting characters in the saga. Since we're on the subject of people who are correct and impossible, let's talk about the Rebel Alliance's own filing system for a minute. Because Saw Gerrera doesn't get remembered as a rebel. He gets remembered as the extremist. That's the word. It's the Alliance's word, from the Alliance's own briefings, used about a man who was there at the founding. And that framing has stuck so thoroughly that a lot of people who've only seen Rogue One come away thinking of him as some warlord on the fringes who happened to have useful information. He was in it from the beginning. Onderon during the Clone Wars, when the Jedi were still running training programs for local insurgencies. He and his sister, Steela, were the ones being trained. That's how far back he goes. He was fighting the Separatists before the Empire existed, and he never really stopped, and by the time of Rogue One, he'd been at it for something like 25 years, without a break. So, what he was right about. He was right that the Empire was building a planet killer. He had a source, he had a defector, and he'd worked out roughly what it was. An Alliance High Command's position on this was that the report was not sufficiently reliable to act on, and also that acting on it would mean a full war they weren't ready for, which is a completely reasonable institutional response, and it was also, in the event, wrong, because the thing existed and it was almost finished. He was right that the Senate was a stalling mechanism. There's a strand of the rebellion's politics all through this period where the argument is essentially we should keep working through legitimate channels while we build capacity. And Saw's view was that the channels had been dead for 2 decades, and that everyone still using them was providing a service to the people who'd killed them. Andor, incidentally, does this argument better than anything else in the franchise. And I've got a whole thing to say about Luthen Rael and Karis Nemik that I'm saving for the end. He was also right about the thing that eventually became Alliance doctrine, which is that you cannot fight an empire with a conventional army until quite late in the process, and that everything before that point is small cells, doing small violent things and surviving. The Alliance came round to this entirely. By the time of the Death Star, they're running exactly the sort of operation Saw had been running for 20 years. They've just got better uniforms and a chain of command. The difference between a partisan and a soldier turns out to be mostly a question of whether somebody has issued you a rank. And he was right that the Alliance's caution was costing lives. Every month they spent consolidating, people were dying in places the Alliance had decided not to go yet. But here's where I want to be honest, because I don't think this one resolves, and I'm not going to pretend it does. The Alliance was also right about him. His methods were genuinely appalling. He ran operations that got civilians killed. He tortured people, and we see it in the film. He keeps a creature in a tank on Jeddah specifically for extracting information from prisoners, and he uses it on Bodhi Rook, who is a defector, bringing him the exact intelligence he'd spent his life trying to get. That's the man. That's not a smear from a rival faction. That's what's on screen. And a rebellion that behaves like that has a real problem, which is that it can win and still lose, because the thing it becomes in the winning is the thing it was fighting. That's not squeamishness. That's the actual strategic question, and the Alliance leadership had it right. So you've got 2 correct positions that cannot both be acted on, and the way it resolves in practice is that the movement splits, both halves are diminished, and the Empire gets another few years. Fun detail I like. Jedha. He's holed up in the catacombs of a holy city on a moon the Empire is strip mining for Kyber, running a partisan cell out of the ruins of a religion. The location's doing an enormous amount of work in that film, and almost none of it gets said out loud. Everything about Saw's position is the last surviving bits of something older being ground down for parts. There's a detail about the partisans on Jeddah that I think is the sharpest thing in that film. They're not popular. The locals aren't secretly cheering them on. When the ambush kicks off in the street, the ordinary people of Jeddah City are running for cover from both sides, and the film doesn't cut away from that. A grocer diving behind a stall doesn't much care which flag the shooting is under. That's the cost of Saw's approach, expressed in about 15 seconds of background action, and it's put there deliberately, and nobody comments on it. His death is the bit that gets me. The city's coming apart, the super lasers fired at low power on a single target, and the shockwave is chewing across the landscape. And he could run. He's got the option. He's spent decades running, that's the whole skill set. And he decides he's done, and he tells Jin to go, and he stays and watches it come. The last thing he says is about saving the rebellion, which from a man the rebellion had disowned is a hell of a way to sign off. And then, and this is the bit that makes the whole thing land, the message he died protecting goes to Yavin, and the Alliance Council convenes and holds an emergency debate about whether to believe it. He was right about the weapon, right about the timeline, right about what needed doing, and the immediate consequence of him dying for it is a committee meeting in which the majority votes not to act. Andor gave him a scene a while back that I think is the best writing he's ever had, and it's essentially him explaining himself to a room of people who don't want to hear it. He's meeting representatives of the other rebel factions, all of them with their own ideology and their own acronym and their own opinion about what the movement should be. And rather than negotiate, he goes through them one by one, naming exactly what each of them believes and exactly what it's worth. And then he says the thing about himself, which is that what he is isn't sane, and that the work doesn't get done by people who are. It's not a defense. He isn't asking to be excused. He's telling a room of amateurs that the job they're all discussing requires becoming something none of them want to become, and that he's already done it, and that this is why they find him unbearable. And the scene is staged so that he's clearly the most unpleasant person present, and clearly the only one who's thought it through. Fun detail, he spends that whole meeting surrounded by volatile fuel, which is the same substance that ends up defining half the plot of that show, and he's talking about combustion the entire time, without ever quite saying so. Very tidy bit of writing. He's the hardest character on this list to like and one of the hardest to argue with, and I'm genuinely comfortable leaving that unresolved. I don't think the story wants it resolved. Every time I rewatch Rogue One, I come out with a slightly different balance on him, which is more than I can say for most characters in this franchise, and I think that's a compliment to whoever built him. 2 teachers, 1 student, 1 disagreement. That's the whole thing, really. Everything else in the original trilogy is scaffolding around a single argument that 3 people have across 2 films, and the 2 who lose it are the 2 wisest beings alive. The position Obi-Wan and Yoda both hold is this, and they hold it independently, and neither of them ever wavers. Anakin Skywalker is dead. What's left is Vader, and Vader is not a person who has done bad things. He's a thing that used to be a person. There is no route back. The only resolution available is that Luke kills him, and if Luke can't do that, then everything they've all worked for comes apart. Obi-Wan says it in the swamp with his ghost voice on. Yoda says it from his deathbed, with about as much finality as he's capable of. And when Luke pushes back, when he says he can't kill his own father, the answer he gets is essentially that then the Emperor has already won. These are not stupid people. This is not a straw man position that the film sets up to knock over. Yoda is nearly 900 years old and has personally watched the Jedi Order be destroyed by exactly this man. Obi-Wan trained him, loved him, and left him burning on a volcanic riverbank because it was the only thing he could think of to do. Between them, they have the most evidence any 2 beings in the galaxy could possibly have, and every bit of that evidence points the same way. They're still wrong. And what I find so good about this, and it's taken me a lot of rewatches to see it properly, is that Luke can't actually argue his side. He doesn't have a case. He's not producing evidence. He's got no counter-analysis, no strategic reasoning, nothing that would survive 5 minutes of pressure in any room where people take decisions. He's got a feeling, and he won't let go of it. He says it plainly on Endor. Tells Leia there's good in him. He's felt it. That's the whole submission. And it's not a strong submission. If you were sitting on the council, you'd throw it out. There's a bit before that, on the second Death Star, that I think is the most underrated moment in the trilogy. He's a prisoner. He's on a shuttle with his father, in binders, and he's just told the man to his face that he's coming with him, that he can be turned back. And Vader's response is very quiet and very sad. He says something about it being too late for him. That's not a refusal. That's an admission. That's a man agreeing with the diagnosis and disagreeing only about the prognosis. And Luke clocks it, and it's the last confirmation he needs. And from that point on, he's not gathering information anymore. He's just waiting for the moment. There's an intermediate step I always forget about until I rewatch it, which is the mask. Luke asks him to take it off, and Vader says he'd die, and Luke says he wants to see him with his own eyes just once, and the man does it, knowing what it costs, and underneath is a pale, scarred, unremarkable old bloke who looks like he's been ill for a very long time. That's the whole argument made physical. For 2 films, Vader has been an outline in black armour with a voice like industrial machinery. And the reason nobody can imagine him being redeemed is that nobody can imagine him being a person. And then the helmet comes off, and he is very obviously a person, and a tired one, and the case Obi-Wan and Yoda had been making evaporates on sight. Fun detail, He asks Luke to help him take it off. He can't do it himself, or won't. The last thing Anakin Skywalker needs assistance with is being looked at. The throne room is where it pays off, and it pays off in a way that I think is genuinely unusual for this list, because it's immediate. Almost everyone we've talked about tonight got vindicated years later by people who didn't know they were doing it. Luke's red produces the outcome inside about 90 seconds. He loses his temper first, which matters. He's not serene about it. Palpatine gets him with the one thing that works, which is telling him his sister will be turned instead. And Luke comes down the stairs absolutely furious and beats his father half to death on the floor of that room. Cuts his hand off. Stands over him breathing hard, and then he looks at his own hand. The mechanical one. And he works out what he's about to become, and he throws the lightsaber away. Throws it away. In front of the Emperor, having already won the fight, there is no tactical reading of that decision in which it isn't insane. And the argument settles in the next 30 seconds, because Palpatine starts killing him, and the man on the floor, who has been an obedient instrument for over 2 decades, who has personally overseen the deaths of more people than anyone can count, gets up and throws his master down a shaft. Not because he was argued into it, because his son gave up rather than fight him, and there turned out to be enough of a person left in there to notice. Fun detail, and it's a small one that I love. Luke brings his father's lightsaber to that meeting, the one Anakin built, the one Obi-Wan kept for 20 years, and handed over on Tatooine, the one that's been the physical token of the whole inheritance for 3 films. And the way he wins is by putting it down. The entire trilogy resolves on somebody voluntarily dropping the thing. Now, the counterweight, because otherwise this section turns into a greetings card, and I don't want that. The sequels put Luke on the other side of the exact same argument. Middle of the night, hut on an island, standing over his sleeping nephew with the lightsaber lit, having sensed what the boy might become. And he ignites it for about 1.5 seconds before he's disgusted with himself, and that 1.5 seconds is enough to lose everything. Because here's the thing, it rhymes. The man who was right about redemption at 23, whose whole case was that you don't get to write someone off based on what they might become, is the same man who 50 years later looks at a sleeping teenager and makes a threat assessment, which is what Obi-Wan and Yoda did to Vader. Luke became his own teachers. That's not a contradiction of his arc. That's the least comfortable possible continuation of it. It's worth saying that Yoda, to his enormous credit, got there in the end. Not in time to help, but he got there. Right at the close of the war, before any of this, he goes through something that changes his position, and the language he starts using afterwards is different. He talks about the Jedi's arrogance, not as a failing of individuals, as a property of the institution. He'd spent 8 centuries as the most senior figure in an organization that had convinced itself it was the good side of a binary, and he came out the other end of that war saying in effect that the certainty was the problem. He does change his mind eventually. The last thing he tells Luke is to pass on what he's learned, including the failure, which is about as close to an apology as a 900-year-old is going to manage. Personal opinion, and then I'll leave him. What I like about Luke's rightness is that it's not clever. Everyone else on this list tonight was right through observation or analysis or having information nobody else had. Luke was right through stubbornness. He had no evidence and 2 authorities against him, and he simply refused to accept the conclusion, and it turned out the conclusion was wrong. I don't think that's a general life lesson. Refusing to accept the conclusion is usually just being difficult. But it worked once at the only moment it needed to, and the galaxy got about 30 years of peace out of it, which is more than most of the correct people on this list managed to buy with all their evidence. A senator stands up in a legislative chamber and tells a hostile room that there is an armed force out there preparing for war, that she has the financial records, that she has seen the base, and that they need to act now. And the room is dismissive. Some of them are openly hostile, Most of them would simply rather she sat down. Her mother did the same job, in a chamber that served the same function, about 50 years earlier, and got the same result. Nobody in the room makes the connection, because almost nobody in the room knows they're related. This is Bloodline, Claudia Gray's novel, set 6 years before The Force Awakens, and it's one of the better things in the modern canon precisely because it's about paperwork. So, the state of things. The New Republic Senate has been deadlocked for years, split between two parties. The populists, Leia's lot, who want authority pushed out to individual worlds, because the last time the galaxy centralized power, it produced an emperor. And the centrists, who want a strong central government with a proper military, because the last time authority was dispersed, the galaxy fell apart into a war. Both of those positions come out of the same historical trauma. That's why neither side can beat the other. And a good number of the centrists are former Imperials, or the children of them, who look back at the Empire and remember the trains running on time. That's not a fringe. That's a block in the legislature with committee seats. Leia's in the middle of this doing the actual work, and she stumbles into it sideways. She's investigating a crime cartel, which leads to a paramilitary group called the Amaxines, which leads to a funded, organised, extremely well-equipped military force training in the outer systems, with no legitimate purpose whatsoever. And she brings it to the Senate, properly, with the banking data, and most of them are hostile. The reception is not neutral, it's not thoughtful, it's not let's convene a committee, it's irritation. One centrist senator backs her up, having seen the base himself, and it costs him more than either of them expected. The other thing happening at the same time, and this is what makes the book sting, is that Leia's political position collapses for reasons that have nothing at all to do with whether she's right. Her parentage comes out, publicly. The most famous woman in the galaxy turns out to be Darth Vader's daughter, and that piece of information does more to the Senate's willingness to listen to her than any amount of evidence could undo. And the detail that makes it worse is that she'd known this was coming for years and had said so. Her whole political position, the reason she was a populist in the first place, was that a galaxy which concentrates authority produces an emperor. That was not a theory to her, that was a family matter, and the argument she kept losing was to people who said, in effect, that the danger she was describing was 30 years out of date. So there it is, the correct warning, with documentation from the single most qualified person alive, refused on grounds entirely unrelated to its contents. She leaves, walks out of the government her adoptive father helped build, and starts putting together a small private force out of old rebellion contacts and personal favours, because the legitimate institution has declined to defend itself. There's a version of this where she's wrong to leave, incidentally, and I want to give it a fair hearing because it's not a stupid position. A senator who walks out and raises a private army because she lost a vote is doing something genuinely corrosive to a young republic. That's how you get warlords. It's exactly the sort of thing the Empire's apologists would point at. And she does it anyway, knowingly, because she's decided the institution is going to die either way, and she'd rather it died with something left standing. And 6 years later, the Hosnian system is gone. The Senate, the fleet, the capital, all of it, in about 4 minutes, and the thing that did it was funded and built by exactly the network she'd been describing. Fun detail that I find quite funny in a bleak way. The resistance at the start is basically a handful of pensioners who are paying attention. Akbar goes with her. So do a number of others from the old alliance. The most dangerous military organisation of its era begins as a group of people in their 60s and 70s who all independently concluded that the meeting wasn't going anywhere. And I want to make one connection and then leave it because I don't want to hammer it. The argument Padme lost in the old Senate chamber is the argument Leia lost in the new one. Different building, different constitution, different threat, same shape of failure, And the second one happens to a woman who had personally watched what the first one produced. She had all the history. She'd lived through the consequences. It didn't help even slightly. That's the bit I keep turning over. We tend to assume that the reason institutions fail to act is ignorance. That if they'd only known, they'd have moved. And the New Republic knew. The whole thing was less than 30 years old. Half of them had grandparents who'd been there. The information was not the problem. And this wasn't the first time either, which is the part that makes the pattern properly depressing. Go back further, to the years right after the Empire fell. The New Republic's founding instinct was to demilitarize, hard and fast, on the reasoning that a large standing fleet was how you got an empire in the first place, which, again, is not a stupid position. It's a position drawn directly from experience. But it meant that when the Wookiees were still under occupation, and Leia stood up and asked the Senate to go and liberate Kashyyyk, the answer was no. Not our jurisdiction, not the priority. The war's over, we're standing the fleet down, and we can't very well begin the era of peace with an invasion. So she went anyway, unofficially, with people who owed her favours. Which, if you squint, is exactly what she does again, decades later, with the Resistance. Same woman, same legislature, same refusal, same workaround. 2 of the 3 biggest calls of her political career were made by walking out of a building where she'd lost the vote and doing it privately with a small group of friends. That's not a triumphant story about leadership. That's a story about a very capable person spending 30 years discovering that the machinery she'd helped build didn't work, and quietly rooting around it until the machinery got blown up. I think Leia was right, and it didn't help, and that's a more interesting story than the films ever gave her room to be. On screen, she's a general who's always correct, which is a fine thing to be, but it's not dramatically rich. In the book, she's a competent professional, watching a legislature refuse to do its job, and losing, and having to decide what to do about losing. I'd have taken a whole trilogy of that. Right, last one, and I want to end the list on something a bit lighter, because the last few have been fairly heavy going. So, a Vice Admiral takes command of a fleeing fleet, and she is wearing a floor-length evening gown, and her hair is purple. That is the first information the film gives you about Amilyn Holdo, and the film knows exactly what it's doing with it, because a good chunk of the audience makes up their mind about her within about 8 seconds. I include myself in that, incidentally. First time I watched it, I was fully on Poe's side, and I stayed there far longer than I should have. Before that, though, I want to note something about how she's introduced, because it's a genuinely unusual piece of construction. You meet her through Poe's eyes. He walks onto the bridge, he's told who's in charge, and the camera lingers just long enough on the hair and the dress for you to have an opinion. And then someone tells him about her record, which is substantial, and he doesn't take it in, and neither do you, because you've already decided that's a deliberate trap, and the film springs it about 40 minutes later. So, the situation. The Resistance fleet is being tracked through hyperspace, which shouldn't be possible. They can't jump away, they can't fight, and they're burning fuel. Leia's unconscious, Akbar's dead. Command falls to Holdo, and Holdo has a plan, and the plan is this. Keep the cruiser running, keep the First Order's attention on it, and quietly ferry everyone off in small unarmed transports to an abandoned rebel base on a mineral planet called Krat, which has shield doors and a bit of history, and crucially, nobody knows they're going there. The transports are too small to register on the enemy's scanners if the big obvious ship is sitting right there, being big and obvious. It's a good plan. It's not a clever plan. It's just a correct one. It's the sort of plan an experienced officer produces when the situation is bad, and the objective is to have some people left afterwards. What she doesn't do is explain it to Poe Dameron. Now, a lot of the argument about this film lives right there, and I've got a view, which is that she doesn't owe him an explanation, and also that not giving him one was a mistake. Both. He's a captain who's just been demoted for losing most of a bomber wing on an unauthorized attack run. He is, by any normal military standard, not somebody you brief, but he's also, visibly, the sort of man who will do something drastic if he thinks nobody's doing anything. And reading that is part of the job. And I want to be fair to him because he isn't a fool, and the film isn't calling him one. He's operating on a completely reasonable inference, which is that a commander who won't tell you the plan may not have one. He's seen that before. Most people who've worked anywhere have seen that before. The instinct that silence equals incompetence is right often enough to be a useful heuristic. It's just wrong here. And it's wrong in the most expensive possible way, and the film is careful not to let him off, because Leia herself stuns him for it, and then tells him afterwards, quite gently, what it cost. So he mutinies, actually mutinies with a blaster, takes the bridge, and in parallel he's running his own scheme, a plan involving a code breaker and a casino planet and a great deal of improvisation. And it is that plan, not hers, that ends with the First Order finding out about the transports. The transports get picked off in the dark. Most of the resistance dies in the next few minutes, and it's the quietest mass death in any of these films. Just little points of light going out on a monitor while the people watching say nothing, and the part I actually think is clever. And it's not about either of them. It's about us. The film is built so that you side with Poe first. He's the one with the energy, the one being kept in the dark, the one the camera stays with. Everything about the construction of those scenes invites you to be frustrated on his behalf. And then it lets you work out, afterwards, that you were rooting for the person who got everybody killed. That's the same trick the saga has been pulling all night, aimed at the audience for once instead of at a council. The correct person in the room was correct, and they were unglamorous about it, and you didn't like them, and you didn't like them for reasons that had nothing to do with whether they were right. She dies executing the plan she was already executing, incidentally. She doesn't get a speech about having been right. The hyperspace ram is a piece of improvisation at the end of a plan that had already been ruined by somebody else, and it buys the survivors the time they need to get to the base. Fun detail I like a lot. Leia's read on her never wavers for a second. Not once. Old friends, apparently, going back to their teens. And it makes complete sense that the one person aboard with functioning judgment about Holdo is the one person aboard with the most extensive personal experience of not being believed. There's one bit of context that I think gets left out of every argument about this film, and it changes the picture a fair amount. Poe had been demoted that morning, not metaphorically. Leia had stripped his rank in person for disobeying a direct order to withdraw, which cost the Resistance its entire bomber wing to destroy one ship. So by the time Holdo takes command, the man demanding to be briefed on the escape plan is a pilot who has just, within hours, demonstrated that he will ignore instructions from the person he respects most in the galaxy. Briefing him isn't an obvious call, it might still have been the right one, but the film gets accused of Holdo withholding information for no reason, and there is a reason, and it's sitting right there in the previous scene. The other thing worth noting is how little the plan asks of anyone. There's no heroism in it. Nobody gets a moment. Everyone gets into a small unarmed shuttle, sits down, and goes quietly to a disused mine on a salt planet. That is what a good plan looks like when it's working, and it is completely undramatic, and I suspect that's the real reason so many people couldn't accept it. We don't actually like correct plans. We like the person with the improvised alternative and the better hair. And to finish the list on something light, I find it quietly hilarious that the most divisive character in the sequel trilogy is divisive for the crime of doing her job competently while dressed nicely. She's not a schemer. She's not hiding anything sinister. She's a middle-aged officer with a sensible evacuation plan and an unusual sense of occasion, and about half the internet has been arguing about her for the better part of a decade. I don't know. Sometimes I think the entire theme of this video is just that being right is a terrible look on people. So that's 12 of them. 12 arguments, all lost at the time, all of them turning out to have been the right end of the thing. I'd rather not build to a big point here, because there isn't really one, and it's late. But before I wind down, I want to mention a few I couldn't fit, because some of them probably should have been in the main list and I just ran out of room. Bail Organa. He was right that the twins had to be separated and hidden, and right in a way that required him to make a very cold decision, very fast, in a medical bay, minutes after everything had gone wrong. He was also right about the slow build. He spent 20 years being a respectable senator with excellent tailoring and a rebellion in his back pocket. And the reason the alliance existed at all was that somebody had been quietly stocking it since the day the Republic ended. Karis Namik from Andor, who I've been saving. Young Ernest writes a political manifesto that everyone around him treats as a bit of a hobby, slightly embarrassing in the way that a young man with a manifesto usually is. And then he's fatally injured in an accident during the heist and dies within a day or so of the only operation he was ever part of. And the manifesto survives him and gets passed hand to hand, and years later it's being read aloud to people who never met him. His whole argument was that tyranny looks total right up until the moment it isn't, because it has to be everywhere at once, and freedom only has to be somewhere. He didn't live to see a single thing he predicted. He was right about all of it. Luthen Rael, same show, the other end of the same argument. A man who has calculated exactly what he is spending and has decided to spend it anyway. He knows the future he's buying is not one he'll be in. There's a monologue about it that I'm not going to attempt to reproduce, because I'd only mangle it, but the substance is a man listing everything he's given up and concluding that the sunrise happens whether or not he sees it. Being right in his case isn't an argument he wins. It's an invoice he's agreed to pay. Galen Erso, who was right that the only sabotage available to him was one designed to be found by somebody else decades later. He built a flaw into a weapon and then spent years being a collaborator in the eyes of everyone who mattered, including, for a long time, his own daughter. Nobody was ever going to tell him it worked. Jyn Erso, who was right that the message existed and that somebody had to go and get it, and who made that argument to a council that voted against her, and then went and did it anyway, with about a dozen volunteers. The Alliance formally declined to authorise the mission that saved it, and C-3PO, who I genuinely think deserves a place on this list, and never gets one. He is right about the odds every single time. Every time. He does the calculation, he announces it accurately, and the running joke of the entire saga is that the protagonists tell him to shut up and then do the improbable thing anyway, which works because they're the protagonists. But he's not wrong. He was never wrong. He's a man delivering correct statistical analysis in a franchise where correct statistical analysis has no predictive value whatsoever. And I think there's something quite tragic in that if you look at it too long. So let's not. And then Obi-Wan, who's the inversion, and who I wanted to save for last, because he's on the wrong side of the most important argument in the saga. He tells Luke, flatly, more than once, that Vader is gone, that there's nothing left. And he's the one with the most direct evidence anybody could possibly have. And he loses that argument to a farm boy with no case and a feeling. And losing it is the single most useful thing he ever did. Because if Luke had listened to him, if he'd taken the advice from the wisest person he knew and gone into that throne room intending to do the job, one of two things happens. Either he dies or he succeeds and takes his father's place at the Emperor's side, which is the outcome Palpatine was arranging the whole time. Obi-Wan's counsel, followed correctly, produces the Sith's preferred result. His being wrong is load-bearing. I like that a lot. It's a nice corrective to a video like this one, honestly, because the last 2 hours have been me lining up people who were right and got ignored, and it'd be easy to come away with the tidy conclusion that listening is good and dismissing is bad. And then you've got Obi-Wan Kenobi Sincere, experienced, deeply informed, and completely wrong. And a 19-year-old ignoring him is what saves everything. The other thing worth noticing, now I've laid them all out next to each other, is how few of them ever find out. Fives died mid-sentence. Padme died about 4 hours after her side of the argument became permanently moot. Barriss went off into the dark, and the record of what happened to her turned up decades later in a corner of the canon most people haven't watched. Saw got a shockwave. Nemik got an accident on a job. Galen never heard. Dooku got 8 seconds and a look of mild surprise. Maul got told, in the sand, by a man who had no reason to give him anything. Luke got told immediately, which is almost unique. And Leia got told by an entire star system being deleted from the map, which is a form of confirmation nobody should have to accept. The rest of them just got on with it and then stopped. Which is, I think, the honest version. Being right is not usually an event. It doesn't come with a moment. Most of the time it's a thing that gets established quietly afterwards, by people who weren't in the room and don't know your name. Anyway, the thing I keep coming back to across all of this is that none of these institutions rejected the correct information because they thought it was false. That's not what happened in any of these cases. The Jedi Council didn't examine Dooku's claim and find a flaw in it. The New Republic Senate didn't audit Leia's banking records and find them wanting. Nobody disproved Fives. They rejected it because of who was holding it and because of what accepting it would have obliged them to do. Barriss was a criminal. Dooku was a Sith. Maul was a murderer. Saw was an embarrassment. Holdo was irritating. Leia was Vader's daughter. Fives was a clone with no rank whose voice was shaking. In every single case, there was a reason available that let the room avoid the substance, and every single time, the room took it. That's not really a Star Wars thing. It's just how committees work. A true statement turns up attached to an unacceptable person, and the room resolves its discomfort by dealing with the person rather than the statement. And the statement sits there, still perfectly true, waiting for somebody more presentable to say it in about 6 years, by which point whoever said it first has been reassigned or exiled or written up as a rare Ringo Vinden parasite. The saga does that pattern more consistently than any story I can think of, and I don't think it's entirely on purpose. I think it's what happens when you write 40-odd years of stories about institutions and take the institutions seriously. Right, that's me done for the night. If you fell asleep somewhere around the Jedi Council, good, that was the idea. If you're still here, I hope something in it was worth staying up for. I'll probably do another one of these. There's an obvious companion piece about the characters who were confidently wrong, though I suspect that one would run considerably longer, and I'd have to say some unkind things about the Jedi archives.